So the impact of the past, got more Rhetoric coming right up. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Conversations Logic Reason. And as always, I want to say thank y'all for joining me today. So I have more rhetoric for y'all now. Impacts of the past is an example of fictitious notions. Getting a bunch of nonsense that black folks believe that's just simply not true. Now, normally arguments of the past will fall under historical crime. But in this case, impacts of the past, honestly, truly, is really non-existent when you look at all the facts. Black victims are constantly crying about the past. They talk about what happened to black people in the past, the laws, the system, the racism that really truly exists that we can point to. They can point to, Jim Crow, segregation, separate but equal things that kept black folks separate from other groups, or basically primarily whites. They always talk about redlining right now, which is the number one example of rhetoric that you'll hear cried about, and in a lot of ways it's true. And they will say that there was that systematic racism that stifled and in many cases hindered blacks, and it's still persistent and hindering and impacted us till today. Well, there's a major problem with that though. Blacks in the past, basically, they basically were progressing in America, as we. They persevered and were progressing in America in spite of that past system, which we can say it existed. We can say that the system was against black folks in the past, but in spite of that, black folks were making economic gains and leaps and bounds. From 1940 to 1980, we saw, the black male income increase 50% faster than white males. In 1940, the average black man had 43% of the wealth, made 43% of what a white male made. Well, by 1980, a black male was making 73% of what a white male made. As far as the poverty amongst black people, in 1940, the poverty rates among black people were 87%. By 1960, that had dropped to 47%. So black people nearly cut the poverty rate in half in 20 years. Remember all those towns and shops that black folks cried that the white man burned down, and they talk about Black Wall Street, the Columbia race riot. All this stuff happened under Jim Crow, and black people had to build these things in order for them to burn it down. So black people back then did seem to be too fazed by any of these laws. They were actually closing the income gap with white people, and they were making gains. And they were basically making gains in this country. So it was never a system. The question I have to ask though is, how exactly is it then that black people today seem to be more impacted by the system of the past than the black people in the past who actually lived through it? They were they basically making gains way better than what black folks are doing today. And basically, if you notice, the gains were never derailed by any system, any racism, any supposedly allegedly law or system against black people. You notice that the gains among black people got derailed by the decline in the black family. So then why are we focused on alleged system that didn't stop blacks in the past, when we're not focusing on the real culprit, and that's the black family, the destruction of the black family? But I still need to know this. I need to ask this question to anybody. How exactly are black people today more impacted than blacks in the past? And the answer to that question is we're not. We're not impacted by none of that. We're impacted by the destruction of the black family and the horrible mentality that we've seen that developed out of that, because black people weren't victims like this in the past. They wouldn't have been making those gangs if they were black, if they were as big a victims as black people today. I mean, there's nothing off limits to a black person today. There's nothing that a black person can do. And y'all know I always ask the question, what job or income or lifestyle or career path or sector of society is off limits to blacks just for being blacks? Is there a university that black people can't go to for being black? Is there a field of study that a black person can't go into for being black? No. So once again, the problem isn't impact of the past. The problem is the impact of horrible mentalities that was born out of the destruction and the decline of the black family. Anyway, if you ever hear any of these race hustlers crying about impacts of the past, well, now you know, and knowing it's half the battle, and it's always y'all. Until next time.